The first trace of the agreement appears in a brittle parchment preserved in the county archive, a document dated in the year 1883. It records a transfer of land from Bartholomew Hargreave to preacher Eli Cartwright, though nothing about the exchange resembles an honest transaction. The script lists no payment, only a phrase written with unsettling precision: "The obligations shall continue as agreed." Later generations would learn that the obligations were not financial, and certainly not holy. Those closest to Eli remembered the week the arrangement began. A new fence rose around the parish grounds, far too costly for the community's humble earnings. Fresh shingles appeared atop the chapel, and Eli's sermons shifted so quickly toward themes of obedience that even the older parishioners exchanged uneasy glances. Only Miriam Cartwright understood the true price of those improvements, for she bore it herself. Miriam was a quiet woman in her mid-20s, and though her marriage to Eli had long felt strained, she never imagined he would offer her as part of a bargain. Yet one evening he told her she must visit Hargreave's estate. He spoke calmly, as if discussing weather or crops, and insisted that the parish's future depended on her willingness to secure the land the Lord intended for them. She went because refusal meant shattering everything she had built her life around. When she returned, she refused to speak of what transpired, though her silence carried more truth than any confession. Hargreave, satisfied with the first exchange, soon demanded more. His estate grew darker by reputation, and the local women whispered that he indulged in appetites shaped not by affection, but domination. Eli listened, nodded, and accepted each demand without hesitation. The bargain no longer revolved around his wife alone. The landowner wanted new offerings, and he wanted them untouched by marriage or prior bond. Eli began selecting adult women from his congregation, always those in their early 20s, always the ones with the least power to resist. He guided them into his study with gentle words about spiritual duty, and when they emerged, their faces bore the same distant fear Miriam carried. Each time Eli delivered another woman to Hargreave's estate or down into the stone chamber beneath the church, the landowner's expectations grew bolder. Some nights Eli staggered back from the hidden cellar, shaken by whatever he had witnessed. Other nights Hargreave summoned him to join in the rituals he devised, rituals that twisted piety into something grotesque. Eli complied, convincing himself that he was preserving the parish, even as he became bound to a cycle he could never escape. The town saw only prosperity. They sensed something was amiss, but the painted pews and new chapel bell distracted them from the truth. No one asked what price Eli had paid, or who else was being demanded as payment. The quiet bargain had been struck, and its cost was just beginning. Miriam Cartwright had always carried her burdens quietly. Even before the agreement with Bartholomew Hargreave, her marriage to Eli felt more like a duty than a partnership. She respected his position, supported his sermons, and tended to the parish women with a gentle steadiness that made her well-liked. Yet beneath her calm exterior lived an ache she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Eli's devotion belonged not to her, but to the image of himself he believed he needed to uphold. The night she first returned from Hargreave's estate, she sat at the edge of her bed without removing her shoes. The lantern flickered across her face, revealing a tension so deep it seemed carved into her bones. Eli entered the room, thanked her for doing what needed to be done, and reminded her that the parish now had a future because of her sacrifice. His tone held no warmth, only a conviction that what he had arranged was righteous. Miriam did not reply. She simply lowered her eyes and folded her hands tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together by force. Over the following weeks, The weight of Eli's bargain grew heavier. Hargreave sent requests at irregular intervals, sometimes by letter, sometimes through brief visits to Eli's study. Each request carried the same ominous understanding. Miriam must attend him again. The more the landowner gained, the more he demanded, and Eli accepted every condition without hesitation. Miriam attempted to rationalize her compliance. She told herself that the church needed stability, that the congregation depended on Eli, that refusing would harm more than herself. Yet each visit to Hargreave left her feeling hollowed, as if a small piece of her had been sealed away, where she could no longer reach it. It was during the 3rd month of this arrangement that Eli introduced a new truth, one far more terrifying than what had already been asked of her. Hargreave's demands had evolved beyond her involvement. He now wanted others, specifically young unmarried women from the congregation, all of them adults, but vulnerable in ways Miriam knew too well. The landowner claimed he sought purity for his private rights, and Eli, blinded by ambition and trapped by his own earlier choices, accepted the terms. Miriam felt her breath stop when Eli confided this to her. She stared at him with disbelief, struggling to comprehend how he could lead his own parishioners into the same darkness he had forced upon her. He spoke calmly, as if discussing routine church business. He even insisted that it was necessary to protect the future of the ministry. The words sounded like a sermon prepared in advance, polished and self-assured. "You cannot do this," Miriam whispered. She rarely challenged him, but the horror of this new demand forced her to speak. Eli looked at her with a cold steadiness she had never seen before. "The Lord tests us in ways we cannot always understand," he said. "Our duty is obedience." Miriam rose from her seat and walked to the window. The church stood in the distance, pale in the moonlight, looking peaceful and innocent from afar. A cruel contrast to the truth beneath it and the stone chamber Hargreave had ordered constructed. She understood then that Eli was no longer the man she once hoped he could be. Whatever power the landowner held over him had seeped into Eli's reasoning until he no longer recognized his own corruption. Days turned into weeks, and Miriam watched the subtle changes in the women around her. A few of them, all in their early 20s, began receiving private invitations to meet with Eli for spiritual counsel. Each returned with an unease that mirrored her own. They did not speak openly, yet their eyes held the same mixture of confusion and dread. Miriam tried to warn them gently, though she could not reveal the full truth without risking backlash from Eli or Hargreave. She urged them to stay close to family, avoid late meetings, and keep their wits sharp. Some listened. Others trusted Eli too deeply to suspect wrongdoing. One evening, Miriam found herself sitting alone in the chapel, staring at the altar where Eli preached every Sunday. She prayed, not for the parish, not for her husband, but for clarity. She needed strength to navigate the storm she sensed approaching. The bargain had already shifted beyond anything she imagined, and she feared the consequences would soon spread far beyond their household. The marriage that once felt strained now felt like a cage. The church that once represented salvation now cast a shadow across the entire community. And Miriam, more than anyone, understood that the true cost of Eli's choices had only begun to surface. The unease in the congregation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first faint tremor before the ground shifts. No one spoke openly at first. They only watched one another with the wary caution of people sensing a change they could not yet name. It started with the young women Eli had summoned for private counsel. All were adults in their early 20s, all from families who relied heavily on the church's goodwill. They stepped into his study believing they were being called to discuss spiritual growth, yet each emerged pale and unsettled. Their families noticed the change, but the town's dependence on Eli's leadership kept their questions confined to whispered conversations behind closed doors. On Sundays, the atmosphere inside the chapel shifted. Eli preached with a fervor that felt sharpened, as if he were forcing conviction into his own words. His sermons dwelt heavily on themes of sacrifice, purity, and unquestioned obedience. The congregation listened out of habit and fear of appearing irreverent, yet even the older farmers traded uneasy glances when the preacher's intensity rose too sharply. Behind Eli's back, the rumors thickened. 2 of the women he had counseled stopped attending afternoon gatherings. One claimed illness. Another stayed home to care for her mother, though her mother insisted no help was needed. A 3rd woman started arriving late to service and leaving as soon as the benediction ended, avoiding the preacher entirely. These shifts were subtle, but enough to stir talk among the parish wives, who knew how to read the smallest changes in behavior. What troubled them most was the new routine involving Hargreave. He had always been a solitary man, but now he appeared on church grounds far too often. He arrived unannounced, never participating in the service, never offering a greeting. He walked directly to Eli's study, and the door closed behind them for hours. When he emerged, he looked satisfied. Eli looked worn. The congregation noticed. Miriam noticed more. She began observing the women Eli selected, memorizing their expressions before and after they met with him. Some avoided her gaze, perhaps ashamed or afraid. Others looked to her as if silently begging for answers she could not safely give. She carried their fear with her, pressing it deep into her chest until it became almost unbearable. One afternoon, she overheard 2 mothers by the well, speaking in hushed tones as they collected water. "He called my daughter in again," one murmured. "She will not tell me what he said to her. She trembles when I ask." "The preacher claims it is part of her spiritual direction," the other replied. "But no counsel should leave a grown woman afraid to sleep." Their voices dropped even lower, and Miriam could no longer hear the words, but their faces said enough. The women of the parish were beginning to suspect that Eli's guidance was not as pure as he declared. Still, the town relied too heavily on the church to challenge him outright. Hargreave owned most of the surrounding farms, and Eli controlled the spiritual life of every family. To accuse either man risked losing both livelihood and social standing. Fear held the community together in a silence that grew more oppressive with each passing week. Evening gatherings became places of careful phrasing. People stayed longer but said less, listening for contradictions or clues in one another's words. Men avoided gossip, yet many returned home more watchful of their own daughters, even though all the women involved were grown. A sense of vulnerability permeated the parish, as if something precious were being hunted in plain sight. Miriam felt the tension pressing inward until she could hardly breathe. The stone chamber beneath the church weighed on her thoughts, its single entrance locked by a key Eli kept hidden from everyone. She had never stepped inside, yet she sensed the place held secrets far darker than the congregation imagined. One evening, after Eli concluded another sermon, urging unity and trust, a young woman named Sarah lingered by the doorway. She had been summoned to Eli's study 3 times that month. Miriam approached her gently, offering a polite word of farewell, yet Sarah surprised her by grasping her hand. "I do not want to go back to him," she whispered. "Please, if you can, help me." The plea struck Miriam like a blow. She nodded, though she had no plan and no safe path to intervene. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing another adult woman voice the fear she had carried alone for so long, shifted something inside her. The whispers in the congregation had become more than speculation. They had become warnings. And Miriam realized that if Eli continued his selections, the quiet dread simmering in the parish would soon erupt into something far harder to contain. The stone chamber beneath the church had been a rumor long before anyone knew it existed. Workers who assisted with the parish repairs whispered about a hidden structure on Hargreaves' orders, but Eli dismissed their questions with the authority of a man who expected obedience. Most accepted his explanations because questioning the preacher felt as dangerous as questioning Scripture itself. Yet Miriam had always felt the chamber's presence. It lingered in Eli's late-night restlessness and in the heaviness that settled over him whenever Hargreave visited. She sensed it in the way he guarded certain keys, keeping them close even when he slept. The church stood silent above ground, but something beneath it breathed like a buried secret too large to contain. The truth revealed itself by accident. One morning, while tending the chapel alone, Miriam noticed a draft near the altar floor. A thin line of dust had shifted, exposing the faint outline of a trap door she had never seen before. The square was carved from stone rather than wood, fitted so cleanly into the floor that only a careful eye would detect it. Miriam knelt beside it and pressed her palm against the cold surface. The air that seeped through the cracks felt stale and unwelcoming. She did not dare lift it. She already knew what she would find. As she rose, a soft scrape echoed from below, as if something moved in the darkness beneath the church. Miriam stepped back quickly, her heartbeat hammering in her throat. Whether it was a rat or the shifting of old stone mattered little. The sound confirmed the chamber was real and occupied. Later that afternoon, Eli arrived early for sermon preparation. He paused when he saw Miriam standing near the altar, too still, too aware. His expression hardened for a moment before softening into the practiced calm he used when addressing the congregation. "You should not linger there," he said. "It is uneven stone. I will tend to it myself." She folded her hands to mask her unease. "You never mentioned there was a cellar." "It is storage," he replied. "Nothing more." His voice held finality, and she understood he would not tolerate further questions. But Miriam's discovery only deepened her fear for the young women Eli had been choosing. Sarah's trembling plea still echoed in her mind. If Eli escorted these women below the chapel, rather than directly to Hargreaves' estate, then the landowner's influence extended far deeper than anyone suspected. Miriam wondered how many footsteps had descended those hidden stairs, and how many secrets remained locked beneath the stone. Within the congregation, the tension grew sharper. Eli's sermons had become strained, almost fevered. He spoke of trials, purification, and the need to surrender completely to divine purpose. His eyes lingered too long on the women he selected, and the rest of the congregation felt the shift like a cold draft through a closed window. Hargreaves' presence only fueled their unease. Each visit ended the same way, the landowner leaving with a faint trace of satisfaction on his face, and Eli emerging moments later with the strained look of a man balancing on the edge of decisions he could no longer control. One evening, as twilight settled over the town, Miriam saw Eli guiding another woman toward the church. The woman, Annabelle, was 23 and known for her soft-spoken kindness. She walked beside Eli with uncertain steps, clutching her shawl tightly against her chest. Miriam watched from the shadows of the courtyard, heart racing. Annabelle glanced back once. Her eyes met Miriam's for a split second, asking a question she could not voice. Miriam felt her stomach twist. She gave a subtle shake of her head, not in refusal, but in helplessness. Eli unlocked the chapel door and led Annabelle inside. A moment later, the door shut behind them. Miriam stayed outside until long after darkness swallowed the sky. She listened for voices, footsteps, anything that might reveal what was happening beneath her feet. But the night gave her nothing. The silence became its own warning. The next morning, Annabel attended service, but something about her had changed. She kept her gaze low and her steps hurried. She avoided Miriam entirely, as though proximity alone might pull her back toward whatever had happened below the chapel. Miriam watched her retreat and felt the dread tighten around her like binding rope. The chamber was no longer a rumor. It was part of Eli's bargain. And if Hargreaves' demands continued to grow, the entire congregation stood on the edge of consequences none of them were prepared to face. The stone beneath the church waited, cold and patient, for the next life drawn into its hollow depths. And Miriam feared that silence would not hold forever. The parish ledger had always been a place of routine entries. Attendance numbers, tithes collected, names of families who needed aid. Nothing inside it had ever suggested danger. But as the months passed, Miriam began to notice patterns that unsettled her far more than any rumor or whispered fear. It began with absences. Not many at once, only one woman at a time. Always adults in their early 20s. Always those Eli had summoned for private counsel. Their departures were subtle. One would stop attending Wednesday gatherings. Another would skip a Sunday service. A third would leave the chapel before anyone could greet her. Each change could be explained, yet taken together, they formed a quiet warning. Miriam began studying the ledger after each service. Eli believed she checked it for supply orders and donation lists, but she focused on the names he recorded after his private meetings. Some were noted with brief remarks about ongoing guidance. Others had a small mark beside them, a curved line she had never seen Eli use before. These markings matched the women whose behavior had changed. The pattern grew undeniable. Eli always chose women who lacked strong family ties, women whose parents were aging or who lived alone, women whose livelihoods depended on the church's influence or Hargreaves' land. His choices were deliberate, calculated, and the moment Miriam realized this, her fear sharpened into something closer to horror. One afternoon, she approached Sarah, the young woman who had once begged for help. Sarah stood behind the chapel, washing linens with trembling hands. Miriam waited until she was alone before stepping closer. "You have been called to him again, have you not?" Miriam asked gently. Sarah flinched. "Yes, tomorrow evening." Miriam's pulse quickened. "Do not go alone." Sarah shook her head. "I cannot refuse. He said my soul depends on obedience." She swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Miriam, I do not understand what he wants. He speaks in riddles. He tells me to trust him. But every time I leave his study, I feel less like myself." Miriam placed a hand on her arm, urging calm. "You are not imagining it. Something is wrong. You must be cautious." Sarah nodded, though fear clouded her expression. Miriam watched her walk away and felt a deep ache settle into her chest. She knew Eli's influence had corrupted his judgment, but witnessing its effect on the women he targeted made the danger impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Hargreaves' involvement grew more brazen. He began arriving at the church after dusk, when the congregation was absent, and only the lanterns glowed inside Eli's study. Miriam often heard the low murmur of their conversations from across the hall. Hargreaves' voice was calculated, Eli's increasingly strained. She sensed that Hargreave was no longer requesting favors. He was dictating terms. One evening, After another private meeting, Eli left the study with a parchment tucked inside his coat. Miriam glimpsed the edge of it, Hargreaves' signature in heavy ink. "What has he asked of you now?" she ventured. Eli paused, his expression unreadable. "It is not your concern. The church will prosper." "There are other ways to ensure prosperity," Miriam said. "Not for us," Eli replied quietly. "Not anymore." His answer chilled her more than any threat could have. The turning point arrived later that week when the town held a small gathering to celebrate a recent harvest. It was a rare moment of joy, and for a few hours the parish seemed to breathe freely again. But Miriam noticed something troubling. Eli stood apart from the festivities, observing the young women more intently than the celebration. His gaze lingered on one in particular, a quiet seamstress named Clara. She was 24, humble, and recently orphaned. Eli watched her the way Hargreave watched opportunity. Miriam moved toward Clara, compelled by instinct rather than strategy. "Clara, stay near the crowd," she said softly. "Do not wander off tonight." Clara laughed lightly, unaware of the danger. "Miriam, you worry too much." Miriam did not. The next day, Eli wrote Clara's name inside the ledger. The mark beside it was the same curved line that haunted Miriam's every thought. That evening, Eli began preparing the chapel. He lit lanterns along the aisle, his movements strangely ceremonial. He straightened the altar cloth, then slipped the key to the stone chamber into his pocket. Miriam watched him, feeling her strength thin like worn fabric. Every choice Eli made drew him deeper into the landowner's hold. Every name marked in the ledger signaled another life pulled toward the chamber below. The pattern was no longer merely visible. It was accelerating, and Miriam knew that if she did not act soon, the next woman summoned might never return unchanged. The town of Hawthorne Hollow had always depended on two men, though neither deserved such trust. Bartholomew Hargreave controlled the land, and Eli Cartwright controlled the spirit. Most families needed both to survive. This dependence, once merely inconvenient, now shaped every whispered conversation and every uneasy glance exchanged across supper tables. The women knew something was wrong. The men sensed it too, though they pretended otherwise. But Hawthorne Hollow was bound by unspoken rules, the most powerful of which was silence. That silence began to crack. It happened one evening when the Miller family visited the Cartwrights to deliver fresh bread. Their daughter, Ruth, an adult woman of 26, paused at the chapel doorway, noticing the faint scent of oil drifting from beneath the altar. "Has someone been working down there?" she asked casually. Eli stiffened. Miriam stepped forward before he could respond. "Only repairs," she said. "The foundation settles strangely in older buildings." Ruth accepted the answer, though her tone suggested she noticed the tension in the air. Miriam guided her out quickly, knowing any prolonged question risked unraveling the secret Eli and Hargreave had constructed. But the question stuck. The next day, Miriam overheard two farmers talking while loading grain. "Something is happening inside that chapel," one muttered. "Seen lantern light burning there past midnight. Thought churches slept when people did." "Best leave the preacher to his business, this," other replied. "We all depend on him." Dependence, Miriam thought, had become the town's greatest weakness. It forced the community to protect Eli, even as he endangered them. No one dared challenge him. No one dared challenge the man who owned their land either. The result was a collective blindness, a silence masquerading as loyalty. That silence reached a dangerous edge the night Clara was summoned. Clara, the seamstress marked in the ledger. Clara, who laughed gently when Miriam warned her. Clara, who trusted Eli because he had once baptized her mother and helped bury her father. Miriam sensed the desperation behind Eli's decision. He needed to satisfy Hargreave again. Clara had become his next offering. Miriam waited outside the study door when Clara arrived, hoping to intercept her. But Eli met Clara first, offering a reassuring smile that felt painfully hollow. He led her inside and closed the door behind them. Miriam stood alone in the dim hallway, feeling her breath thin with dread. She pressed her ear to the door, but heard only Eli's low voice. She could not hear Clara at all. Moments later, footsteps sounded behind her. Hargreave appeared, dressed in a dark coat, his expression unreadable. He offered Miriam a polite nod, as if arriving for a simple meeting rather than something far darker. "Mrs. Cartwright," he said softly, "always diligent." Miriam stepped aside, fighting the instinct to recoil. "Why are you here?" "Hawthorne Hollow depends on partnership," he answered. "Your husband and I ensure that partnership remains strong." The implication chilled her. He entered the study without knocking. Eli's voice faltered as the door opened, revealing both men to Clara. Miriam saw the young woman's face pale, though she remained seated, unsure how to interpret the sudden shift in atmosphere. Miriam could no longer watch. She hurried outside, the night air cold against her skin. She stepped toward the chapel, unable to shake the image of the stone chamber beneath it. That place had consumed so many secrets already, and she feared it would soon claim Clara as well. Minutes passed, then an hour. The churchyard remained quiet except for the occasional flicker of lantern light through the chapel windows. When Eli finally emerged, his expression looked carved from stone. Hargreave followed close behind, satisfied in a way that made Miriam's stomach twist. Clara walked between them, silent, her posture stiff. She avoided Miriam's gaze and kept her hands clasped tightly as if anchoring herself. "Clara will be attending additional sessions," Eli said, "for her own spiritual refinement." Miriam recognized the phrase. It meant Clara had been chosen, and the process had begun. The next morning, the town acted as though nothing had changed, but Miriam saw the truth everywhere she looked. Women walked in pairs instead of alone. Families watched Eli more closely. Even the men, usually dismissive of rumor, shifted uneasily when his name was mentioned. Hawthorne Hollow was beginning to understand that something dark had taken root in the heart of its parish. Yet fear held their tongues, forcing them to cling to the fragile order that kept them fed and sheltered. Silence had protected Eli for months, but now that silence had begun to rot, and Miriam sensed the moment was coming when the town would no longer be able to pretend. The chamber beneath the church was no longer just a secret. It had become a threat hanging over every family in Hawthorne Hollow. Miriam had lived with dread for months, but nothing prepared her for the moment she found her own voice cracking under the weight of what she finally had to write. She did not intend to begin a letter. It happened the same way trembling becomes breathing when fear lasts too long. She sat at the kitchen table one late evening, the lamp flickering low, Elijah asleep upstairs, and her hands moved toward the paper as if guided by something deeper than conscious thought. Her first sentence was simple. "I can no longer bear the cost of what Eli has become." The words startled her. She had not spoken them aloud. She barely allowed herself to think them. Yet on the page, they felt honest, carved from truth she had been too afraid to acknowledge. She wrote slowly at first, choosing her phrases with caution. She described Eli's growing reliance on Hargreave, their late-night meetings, the marked names in the ledger. She avoided detail, focusing instead on the fear etched into the faces of the women Eli selected. She wrote about Sarah, about Annabelle, about Clara. Adults, all of them, yet treated as possessions to be handed over. She paused often, listening for Eli's footsteps upstairs. Every creak of the house made her fingers tremble. This letter could not fall into his hands. It was her only record of the truth, the only thing that proved she had not willingly accepted the darkness beneath the church. Halfway through, her writing shifted. No longer a recounting of events, it became a confession of her own breaking point. "Miriam," she wrote in the second person, as if speaking to the version of herself she once hoped she could be. "You have stood beside your husband out of fear, not faith. You have accepted silence because you believed it protected others. But now silence protects only Eli's sins." Ink pooled where her hand shook. She took a breath, steadying herself before continuing. That same evening, the house shuddered with a sharp knock at the door. Miriam's heart seized. She folded the letter swiftly, hiding it beneath the loose floorboard she had pried open weeks ago. When she approached the door, she saw Clara standing on the threshold. Clara looked even more hollow than before. Her clothing was neat, but her eyes seemed dulled, as if some inner light had dimmed beyond restoration. Miriam stepped aside at once, letting her in. "I cannot sleep," Clara whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel like I am back in that chamber." Miriam's breath hitched. "You were taken below?" Clara nodded faintly. "He said it was part of my spiritual testing. I do not remember everything. The lanterns were dim, and there was chanting, or maybe echoes. I felt watched. I felt trapped." "Eli was there?" Miriam asked, though she already knew the answer. Clara hesitated. "I heard his voice. I think he was speaking with Hargreave, but I could not understand their words." Miriam guided her to a chair. "You are safe here." Clara shook her head. "No one is safe as long as that chamber remains open." Her words struck Miriam with a clarity sharper than fear. The chamber had become more than a secret structure. It was a symbol of the corruption consuming Eli, an anchor keeping the town trapped in silence. Clara looked at Miriam with sudden desperation. "Please, you must tell someone. You must make the town see." "I am trying," Miriam whispered. That night, Clara stayed until the moon set. When she left, she walked home with her shoulders squared, though Miriam knew it was only a fragile show of strength. After closing the door, Miriam returned to her hidden letter. She unfolded the page, reading over the lines she had written, and realized it had become something more powerful than a confession. It had become a testimony. If Eli continued serving Hargreave's demands, more women would descend into that stone chamber. More voices would fall silent. More fear would spread through the congregation until Hawthorne Hollow no longer recognized itself. Miriam pressed the letter flat against the table. She would finish it. She would document everything. And when the moment came, she would place it where no one could ignore it. For the first time in months, she felt something stir beneath her dread. Not hope, not courage. Resolve. The first disappearance came quietly, with no alarm and no search. It was Annabelle, the soft-spoken woman, whose name Miriam had seen marked in the ledger. One morning, her mother went to the church asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Eli told her that Annabelle had spoken of wanting a fresh start, a chance to leave Hawthorne Hollow and seek life elsewhere. He said it so calmly that the mother, though confused, accepted it. But Miriam did not. She remembered Annabelle's hollow expression after leaving the chamber. She knew Annabelle would never travel without telling someone, least of all her own mother. Yet the town, so tightly bound to Eli and Hargreave, accepted the explanation without question. Weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was Ruth from the Miller family, a woman known for her honesty and her deep connection to her parents. She was last seen leaving Eli's study at dusk. The next morning, her father stood before the congregation asking if anyone had seen her. Eli stepped forward with the same rehearsed calm, claiming she had confessed to feeling constrained by her life and needed time away. The congregation murmured with discomfort, yet no one challenged him. Hawthorne Hollow depended too heavily on Eli's spiritual authority and on Hargreave's land. To accuse either man would risk losing everything. But Miriam felt the silence closing in like a tightening snare. She noticed the way families watched one another now, the way doors locked earlier, the way women refused to walk alone after sundown. Even the men carried suspicion in their eyes, though none dared speak it aloud. The third disappearance shattered whatever thin trust remained. Sarah, the first woman who had pleaded for Miriam's help, vanished without a trace. Her family searched the fields, the roads, the riverbank. Eli stood before them with solemn sympathy, repeating the same line he had used before. She sought distance for her own well-being. She told me so herself. This time, the words rang hollow, even to those who wished to believe him. Miriam felt something inside her break. Sarah had confided in her. Sarah had feared Eli. Sarah had known the danger of the chamber. There was no universe in which she would willingly leave without warning. The truth was becoming impossible to hide. 3 women, gone. 3 marks in the ledger. 3 stories crafted by the same 2 men. Hawthorne Hollow was beginning to see the pattern, even if no one dared say it aloud. But Miriam knew the silence could not hold much longer. Something was coming, and the town was standing at the edge of it. The winter wind had begun to creep into Hawthorne Hollow when Miriam discovered the ledger, the true ledger, the one Eli never meant anyone to see. She found it by accident. Eli had fallen asleep in his study after a long evening meeting with Hargreave. His papers lay scattered across the desk, the lamp still burning low. Miriam entered only to extinguish the flame, but a stack of documents caught her eye. One parchment corner protruded awkwardly from beneath a larger book, as if hastily tucked away. She hesitated, then lifted the book. The ledger beneath it was thin, bound in dark leather, far older than the parish's usual record books. Her breath stalled when she opened it. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Eli's, but the entries were nothing like the attendance lists or donation tallies she was accustomed to seeing. Each line bore a date, written carefully, followed by initials. E.C. for Eli Cartwright. B.H. for Bartholomew Hargreave. Beside the initials was a single word repeated throughout the ledger: deliverance. The earliest entry matched the period when Hargreave first began demanding more from Eli. The second entry fell on the week Miriam remembered Annabelle vanishing. The third aligned perfectly with Ruth's disappearance. And the fourth, the most recent, bore the date that Sarah had last been seen. Each woman represented by a word that masked everything Eli and Hargreave did not want anyone to acknowledge. Miriam felt her hands tremble as she traced. The ink. The ledger held no detail, no confession, but the structure of the entries told the story clearly. Eli had documented every time he fulfilled Hargreave's demands, reducing the women he selected to a transaction he pretended was righteous. A noise behind her made her snap the ledger shut. Eli stirred, shifting in his chair. Miriam slipped the ledger beneath her shawl before he opened his eyes. "Miriam?" His voice was rough with sleep. "Is something the matter?" "You left the lamp burning," she replied. "I came to extinguish it." He nodded, then sat upright with a tired exhale. "Long night. Hargreave and I discussed plans for the spring." Her pulse pounded at the mention of his name. "Plans concerning the parish?" "Plans concerning its future," he corrected. She forced herself to maintain a calm expression. "I see," but she did not see. Not anymore. She only felt the reality pressing hard against her ribs, a truth too sharp to ignore. The next morning, Miriam read the ledger again in the privacy of her room. The entries were sparse, yet weighted with meaning. She recognized now that the ledger was more than documentation. It was a record of complicity, proof that Eli had willingly participated in the chain of events that led 3 women to vanish. That afternoon, the tension that had been building throughout Hawthorne Hollow finally reached a visible point. The families of the missing women gathered outside the chapel after service, their expressions drawn and wary. They stood close to one another, silent yet unified by fear. One of the fathers stepped forward. "Preacher Cartwright," he said, "we wish to speak with you." Eli stiffened. "Of course. What troubles you?" The father exchanged glances with the others before answering. "Annabelle, Ruth, Sarah, no word from any of them. No letters, no sightings. Not one sign they left of their own choosing." Eli folded his hands in front of him. "Some journeys are personal. Not all are meant to be shared." The father's gaze hardened. "My daughter was not one to run. She would have told me." Eli's voice softened with practiced sympathy. Sometimes the Spirit leads people away for reasons they do not yet understand. The group murmured, but none were satisfied. Miriam watched from the edge of the crowd, the ledger hidden beneath her shawl like a burning coal. For the first time, Eli seemed unsettled. His expression tightened. His eyes drifted toward the chapel, as if checking whether Hargreave might appear. He offered no further explanation. When the families finally dispersed, their doubt had deepened. No one said it aloud, but the suspicion that had simmered for months was beginning to rise to the surface. Later that night, Miriam sat alone at her kitchen table with the ledger open before her. She weighed her choices, each one dangerous. Revealing the ledger meant exposing Eli. Exposing Eli meant challenging Hargreave, and challenging Hargreave meant risking the wrath of a man who held the entire town in his grip. But silence now felt worse than fear. She touched the ink on the page, now dry but still sharp to her eyes, and realized something irreversible. Eli was no longer just trapped. He was accountable. And the ledger in her hands was the key the town needed to finally see him clearly. The winter dawn arrived gray and cold, yet something in Hawthorne Hollow felt sharper than frost. A tension hung over the parish like a held breath. Miriam sensed it the moment she stepped outside. People moved differently, spoke differently, carried their silence with a new weight. The families of the missing women had stopped accepting Eli's explanations, and rumors had begun weaving through the town like thin threads ready to pull everything apart. Miriam held the ledger close as she walked toward the chapel. She had spent most of the night deciding what to do. She knew exposing it would unleash consequences no one could fully predict, yet keeping it hidden meant allowing Eli and Hargreave to continue unchecked. The town deserved the truth. The women deserved justice. Inside the chapel, Eli prepared for the morning service. His coat hung neatly, his sermon pages laid out with precision. But when he looked up at Miriam, his expression revealed a storm he worked desperately to contain. "You are troubled," he said. "You have been for weeks." She stepped forward, the ledger tucked beneath her shawl. "Eli, the town is afraid. 3 women gone, each after meeting you. They deserve answers. He pressed a hand to the pulpit, as if steadying himself. You speak with the emotion of someone who does not see the full picture. Then show me the full picture, she whispered. Eli hesitated. A long, quiet pause stretched between them. Then he said, "Everything I have done was to secure the future of this parish. You may not understand my methods, but the result will outlive us all." "Not like this," she said. "Not at the price of human lives." The chapel door creaked open. Several townspeople stepped inside. Their faces were pale but determined. They had come early, perhaps sensing this morning would be different from any other. They formed a loose circle, watching Eli with a mix of anger and grief. One of the fathers stepped forward. "Preacher, we need the truth." Eli straightened. "I have already given you the truth." Miriam stepped into the center, her pulse racing. She revealed the ledger. "This," she said, "is the truth." For a moment, the room was silent. Eli's face drained of color. The townspeople leaned closer as Miriam opened the book, showing the dates, the initials, the word that had masked so much. "Deliverance," one woman whispered. "That is what you called it?" Eli reached for the ledger, but Miriam pulled it back. He did not shout or protest. His voice dropped to a quiet, desperate plea. "You do not understand what?" Hargreave demanded. "If I refused, he would have destroyed everything. The church, the land, every livelihood bound to him." "And so you gave him people?" one man asked, stepping forward. "People you were meant to protect?" Eli's composure faltered. The force that had driven him for months cracked under the weight of their stares. He looked toward the chapel floor, as if imagining the chamber beneath their feet. "Hargreave promised the parish would thrive," he whispered. "I believed the sacrifice was justified." Miriam's voice softened, but only slightly. "Sacrifice made by choice is one thing. Sacrifice forced on others is something else." Before Eli could respond, the chapel door opened again. This time it was Hargreave. He entered calmly, his presence chilling the room. He surveyed the crowd, then Eli, then Miriam holding the ledger. "So," he said, "the town finally knows." The congregation held its ground. For the first time, Hargreave saw their unity. The fear that had once kept them silent had transformed into collective resolve. "You have no authority here anymore," one of the fathers said. Hargreave's eyes narrowed, but he remained still. His power had always depended on their submission. Now they stood against him, and he knew force would only expose him further. The confrontation did not erupt into chaos. It did not need to. The truth alone dismantled the unspoken contract that had ruled Hawthorne Hollow. Some stepped toward Hargreave, others toward Eli. Both men realized their influence was gone. Later that week, the chamber beneath the church was sealed. The ledger was placed into the county archive as evidence. The disappearances were recorded formally, and the parish slowly began to heal. Not through sermons or prosperity, but through the shared understanding that silence could no longer protect wrongdoing. Miriam kept her final letter, though she never needed to send it. The town had found its voice, and that was enough. And if you, watching this tale unfold, believe that secrets like these must never fade into silence, then make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Because the darkest truths deserve to be uncovered, and you never know what chapter waits beneath the surface.